Howdy, this is Jim Rutt. This is a continuation of my podcast with Lee Smolin. Why was that, do you think? Well, how do you think that his pilot wave theory was almost erased from history?
It's a very interesting question. It's a question about the history of science and the sociology and psychology of scientists, which are not fields that I'm expert in. But let me mention one part of it. A very important mathematician of that day was somebody called John von Neumann, a Hungarian of that same generation. And indeed, von Neumann did many important things. One of them was he invented the standard computer architecture in the 1940s that all the computers use now, with memory separated from processing, for example, was his innovation. But he was a very important mathematician all over the field of mathematics and science and engineering. So, which is to say, he was a very admired and influential guy. And in 1933, I believe, he published a book called The Mathematical Principles of Quantum Mechanics, in which he gave a mathematical proof that there could be no alternative, that a theory that was more complete, that filled in the missing information than quantum mechanics, would have to be self-contradictory or disagree with the experiment. And this theorem, this impossibility proof, as it was called, was very influential. And for the next 20-something years, whenever anybody would talk about why can't there be a more complete description, somebody would say, but you're naive, you haven't studied everything. You have to study von Neumann's proof. Von Neumann has proved it's impossible. And now this is what's really bizarre, is that de Broglie's pilot wave theory was a counterexample to this claim. And by its very existence, de Broglie's pilot wave theory showed that von Neumann's theorem must have been incorrect. Even de Broglie fell for it. Even de Broglie, after the 1930s, who told people who came to him and said, what about your pilot wave theory? And he said, well, von Neumann has proved that's impossible. Now, here's the really, really interesting part of the story. There was a mistake in von Neumann's proof. Great mathematician as he was, he made mistakes, and there was a mistake in that proof. And there was a mathematics student called Greta Hermann who was doing a PhD in the 1930s and was a friend of Heisenberg and some of these other people. She was also a PhD student of Emmy Noether, who was a very important mathematician for some work having to do with the role of symmetry in physics. So which is to say that Greta Hermann was a person who was well situated and in the center of things. And she took to heart the message to study von Neumann's theorem, and she studied it and she found there was a big mistake at the center of it. Roughly speaking, he assumed what he was trying to prove, which is a way even very talented people can mess up sometimes. So he was a great mathematician, but his proof was erroneous. And the proof that his proof was erroneous was seen and worked out by Greta Hermann and published in about 1935. It should have been obvious to anybody anyway by the existence of de Broglie's pilot wave theory. There is an alternative history in which people read Greta Hermann and credited her and began to work again on the pilot wave theory in the middle of 1930s. But that's not what happened. What happened is that it took another physicist, this one, an American called David Bohm, to reinvent the theory, that is de Broglie's pilot wave theory, which he did in the 1950s when he was an assistant professor at Princeton University.
And that there was a 20-year gap, perhaps?
More like a 30-year gap between the two inventions.
Amazing. Then what happened when Bohm refloated the idea? Was it accepted, rejected, attacked, a little bit of both?
Well, a little bit of both. David Bohm was an interesting person. This was during the McCarthy period of all the rabid anti-communism in the United States. And David Bohm, like his supervisor, J. Robert Oppenheimer, and many of the people who were around Oppenheimer, had flirted with communism in the 1920s and 1930s. And as a result, just around the time he came up with this new version of quantum mechanics, he was called before the House Committee on Un-American Activities, and he refused to testify, and he was cited and charged with contempt of Congress, which he was eventually acquitted of. But meanwhile, Princeton did not renew his contract, and he, as a result, couldn't get a job to continue as a physicist in the United States and had to move to Brazil, where they were happy to welcome him.
Interesting. And so did his rediscovery of de Broglie's work then lead to a new generation of realists?
It did eventually, but the reaction at the time was to acknowledge that the theory existed and did what he and Du Bois said it did, but to ignore it. In fact, there's a great quote. There are many good quotes of why people talk themselves into thinking that the best thing to do was just to ignore it as irrelevant. But indeed, J. Robert Oppenheimer, who had been his mentor and thesis advisor and was then director of the Institute for Advanced Study, very famously said, if we can't disprove David Bohm wrong, we must all agree to ignore his theory.
That's not very scientific.
Yes, one wonders. Of course, Oppenheimer was a very good scientist, but he also had problems of his own with the government at about that time. And he had good reason to perhaps want to distance himself from David Bohm, who could be more easily painted as a communist or communist sympathizer. The story is very complicated, and I started to look into it, but it wasn't my main intention. I wanted to tell stories about science to help people understand the scientific issues, but I did not style myself as a biographer. I think there is great history of science and history in general waiting to be written here. Just one aspect of it, let me leave as a hint, is that David Bohm and Einstein were very friendly, and most of that is unrecorded, but they seem to have had some mutual friends in the area and to have communicated through these mutual friends. And it was Einstein. You see, let me go back a step. Why did David Bohm come to reinvent this pilot wave theory, which gave a realist perspective on quantum mechanics? Well, it wasn't his area. He was a plasma physicist, but he decided to write a textbook on quantum mechanics because teaching quantum mechanics was one of his duties at Princeton, and he was dissatisfied with the textbooks that existed. So he wrote a brilliant textbook, which is still used sometimes to this day, which gave a strict defense of the Copenhagen point of view. And Einstein, the legend goes, called him in, saw his textbook, and called him in for a discussion. They were apparently already somewhat friendly. And Einstein somehow gave him enough of a talking to that it made David Bohm go back and reconsider what he had written in defense of the Copenhagen view. And that led directly to his playing around with the equations and the principles and reinventing the pilot wave theory, all within a few weeks of his conversation with Einstein. By the way, just something else a good historian could look into. Freeman Dyson told me that when David Bohm first came to Princeton, he and Freeman had dinner together every night in the black side of town, which was forbidden, explicitly forbidden, but by the rules of Robert Oppenheimer for the fellows at the Institute to go slumming, as it were, to the black side of Princeton. But because of that, he and Freeman went almost every night together.
It's a bunch of interesting personal stories, as there always is.